just a moment, I'll introduce him, but I'd like to begin with something of a sort of an opening devotional that maybe says something about the wilderness. And the thought I have is to say something about the wilderness as both a sort of a blessing and also a curse, that it has both those elements to it. And the text I'd like us to think about for just a second is in Jeremiah, the 2nd chapter, where Jeremiah looks back on the wilderness experience that Israel had for 40 years. And this is what he says. The word of the Lord came to me saying, go and proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem, thus says the Lord, I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, how you followed me in the wilderness in a land not sown. Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of his harvest, and all who ate of it were I can read that. So Jeremiah 2 looks back to the wilderness as a wonderful engagement period of Israel to Yahweh, and it was a honeymoon period. Well, not everybody shared that view. Ezekiel 20 tells the same story, and he looks about in the wilderness as a time of rebellion and resistance to God. So it's the same story told from two different perspectives. For those of you who like your history somewhat half full or half empty, if you read Psalm 105, it's the story of Israel from the half full perspective, as God's leading Israel in the wilderness was a time of growth, etc. If you read Psalm 106, which is the companion psalm, it's the same history told from the glass half empty. And it is kind of Israel in the wilderness as a time of rebellion, etc. So you can see that the wilderness sojourn can be both a blessing and sort of a disaster, depending on who's telling the story. And this week I got to thinking about the story of Elijah. Some of you may have remember our talking about Elijah in a previous class. And in 1 Kings 17, Elijah is sent east of the Jordan because he has proclaimed that there's going to be a drought. And east of the Jordan, he goes by this little brook, this little water place. And there he's what? He's fed by ravens. So the wilderness is a place where God provides, as God provided manna in the wilderness. Now God provides raven food for Elijah. If you go down to 1 Kings 19, there's another sort of wilderness story where Elijah is told to go south of Beersheba in the southern Negev, south of Jerusalem, many miles. And there he goes to sleep, and he's awakened by angels who bring him jars of water and bread. And this happens several times. And eventually enough bread and water so that he can make the 40-day journey down to Mount Sinai. So Elijah experiences both the disaster of the wilderness and also the blessing. And who can forget Jesus' own temptation experience in the wilderness, where he experiences the demonic and the wild beast, as well as what? The word of God that speaks to these temptations. So I leave you with just a kind of a devoted thought that the wilderness can be both and. It's not either or, it can be both and. And that brings me to David's wonderful book that he wrote about his wilderness experience. And let me just say that I sent out, David, to all our class members, the information you gave me about your own biography, and also about the other book that you had written about your experience in West Virginia, Spiritual Autobiography. David is an attorney and has also been an elder at First Presbyterian Church for many years. And his work has been on clean water for places across the world that are in deep need of that. And he's done fantastic work. He can tell you more about that. But I consider David one of my dear friends, and I admire so much what he's done. So, David, with that, it's yours. Welcome aboard.
Well, Frank, thank you so much for those words and for that framing of the religious background. And it's partly because of the the frequency with which wilderness in religious circles have been thought of only in the negative sense that I wrote Wilderness Sojourn in the first place. But let me just mention a few introductory comments here that I'm particularly glad to be with you all and with Frank again. Deborah, my wife Deborah, and I have known Frank for, I don't know, decades. And
The 80s.
and I've often told him that I've never seen someone who leads adult forums, adult educations as effectively as he does. And so it's great to be with you all. And another reason is it gave me a chance to go back and reread Wilderness Sojourn, which I had not done for probably, several decades as well. And I was been particularly mindful of some of the writing and the experiences there, because I think what we've been living through in the past year for all of us with COVID is, you all probably have spoken about this into some context in the adult forum here before, but it's been something of a wilderness experience in and of itself, both definitely a curse in many ways, but also a very surprising blessing. I mean, we would not be meeting like this, as Exhibit 1 for this. But let me just give you some quick background on myself. I grew up in Washington, D.C., never had any experience in the wilderness until I went out to Colorado. I think, Matthew, you went to spend some time in Boulder, but I went to Rocky Mountain School in Carbondale, and then over to law school at Boulder, and spent a lot of time in the canyons of Colorado and a lot of time in the canyons of southern Utah. I know when we use the word wilderness, each of you all will be thinking of certain images of what we mean by wilderness. But for me, just personally, I think most fondly of the canyons of southern Utah. There, I ended up doing a lot of solo backpacking there in the canyons, and led some trips for environmental groups there in the 70s. And I was struck when I went into those canyons for the first time of obviously what would hit most people is just the beauty, the color, the light, the experience of being there at dawn or at twilight, the night sky where you can see even more stars than on a good night in Albuquerque or in Santa Fe. And also the scale. You'd walk in, and I mean, most of us now are in rooms, of limited width here, but you could walk in many of those canyons of southern Utah that were no wider than our rooms today, and the cliffs would be 1,000 feet high. And yet at the same time, the scale, you were very conscious as well as the beauty of creation down to the smallest wildflower. You were conscious as well as I was particularly of the danger, the precariousness of being there, whether it was the possibility of twisting an ankle, of a rock fall, of getting lost, of rattlesnake, scorpion. There's no shortage of peril in the wilderness. And often when I was walking alone, I was struck by what I've just described as a sense of awe of God's creation. And there in the solitude, there in the silence, I felt a sense of gratitude, not to anything that I had created or any humans had created, but praying, very conscious of my vulnerability and my own dependence on God. I had been struck over time. I was involved with a lot of environmental groups at the time. I haven't practiced law. I use law in a lot of the work we do in advocating in DC on these issues, but I haven't practiced law for years. But at that time, I was involved as a lawyer with some environmental groups, and I was always struck with the emphasis that people made on the value of protecting wilderness for recreational values and environmental values. And the argument on oftentimes on the other side about the economic value of wilderness for resources to be extracted. But what I had been experiencing, and I'm sure that many of you have as well, is what I came to call the spiritual values of wilderness. it was that sense of solitude, silence, the awe that you felt, and the summoning up as a result of what you were experiencing of gratitude. And these spiritual values seem to me to be an essential reason for helping to protect wilderness. And yet they had been very seldom written about. And so I started writing, which I enjoyed a lot more than practicing law. And some of my first articles I wrote actually took place in settings that have become more familiar in the last few years. One area was the Bears Ears National Monument in southern Utah, and the other one was the Grand Staircase Escalante region in southern Utah. Both national monuments had been protected under President Obama. The Trump administration rolled back those protections, in some cases shrinking the boundaries about 85% in Bears Ears, which is a place of extraordinary environmental beauty, but primarily cultural beauty, with 100,000 archaeological sites and ruins. And I think that will be re-protected to its original site under the current administration. And I don't know if you all saw on Friday, it's coincidental or providential that we're having this discussion today. On Friday, just 2 days ago, the House of Representatives passed one of the most significant wilderness protection bills in history, protecting 1.3 million acres in Colorado, Arizona, Utah, or in California, and the state of Washington, and now goes on to the Senate. But I had been writing for secular audiences, but I particularly wanted to write for religious audiences. I was a Presbyterian at the time. I had Deborah and I were members of First Presbyterian Church, and Christianity was vitally important to me. And I was struck by the number of times that I heard sermons from pastors talking about wilderness only in a negative sense, or as a negative metaphor, passing through an era of despair and lostness. And so, as Frank mentioned at the top of the discussion here, it's both. It's paradoxical. It's a blessing and a curse. But 99% of the references in most sermons we will have heard over our lives emphasize just the negative. And that's what I thought was so important to try to emphasize, was the positive. I was a religion major at the College of Worcester in Ohio, and I wasn't a Christian at the time, but I took a lot of classes in other religions and in the Old Testament. One of my favorite classes was the prophets. And I was struck. I remembered after my own travels in the wilderness later on in the 70s, the references that so many of the prophets made. Frank just mentioned the line from Jeremiah, but there's similar language with Isaiah and Hosea, where it was in some ways the time when the Hebrews traveling for those 40 years felt their dependence on God most keenly, and were drawn most closely to God. And were most dependent in the sense of manna. I mean, if you all remember, manna came daily. And if you tried to store it overnight, you could not. You had to be, the only exception being on the Sabbath. You were reminded daily of the importance of dependence on God. And I turned towards Christianity after, in that experience that Frank mentioned during a year in West Virginia, followed by time there in early time in Santa Fe. And I was reading the New Testament more often than ever. And I was struck in the Gospels at the number of times, often that I had not heard remarked on often, that Jesus left the disciples behind and went by himself to a mountain or out into the desert. And the Gospels make it very clear why this was happening, as he was using the desert and the mountain as a setting for prayer.
Mhm.
So I began writing for, I wrote some pieces for Christianity Today and Christian Century, making the point of the importance of Christians seeking out wilderness and desert and mountain and protecting these spaces, whether or not they use them, this generation use them, protecting them for future generations as a places to, as creatures, to be reminded of creation and of our Creator. And I think that's the heart of what wilderness was for travelers today and for the ancient Hebrews. There is a setting to be reminded of your dependence on God and your vulnerability. I oftentimes, when I've not been able to take long trips into the wilderness for years. We've got 2 daughters that we helped raise. We've got now 5 grandchildren. I've been working in Washington, D.C. on international water issues for the last 15 years and spending half time with that. So, but whenever I do manage to get out just on what now are long day hikes, I try to take it's the equivalent of like a notepad in the back. And because throughout the walk, throughout the time alone, I will have had, and these insights come from me much more frequently when I am alone than when I'm with people and chattering and talking. I try to write down, what is it that I have learned through this wilderness experience that I do not want to forget. And it was, if you remember, for the Hebrews as well, when they reached the Jordan River, they were told, you're going to forget what you learned here. Remember what you have learned in these 40 days, in these 40 years. And I think it's something comparable here that we should be asking ourselves as we are now entering upon nearly not 40 years, but 400 days of our experience with COVID. What have we learned? What have we taken? What will we take away from this experience that so often, in so many ways, reminds us of our precariousness and our vulnerability, and is equivalent to a wilderness experience? But I know time is short today, and I'd like to begin to land my comment, the plane of my comments here, and bring it back to Frank and yourselves for your own thoughts on this. But I do think that in the same way that I just mentioned the word time, the issue is one of time. It is taking now time to leave distractions behind, and to, whether physically or metaphorically, as Jesus invited, come ye yourselves apart to a desert place and rest a while. What are the daily disciplines that we are using to be reminded of our dependence on God? I don't know about you all, but I've been struck more than I've ever had before about the amount of time during COVID that I've spent in front of a screen. And if we could spend, or any of us spending 5, or 1% of the equivalent time in prayer to God in a given day. So I think the wilderness experience for me was the intentional setting aside of time to be reminded of our dependence on God. And each of us will decide different settings for the wilderness. For some of you, it may be a river in the wilderness. For some, it may be it may be a garden, it may be a neighborhood path. I think, or taken at dawn or at dusk when there are fewer people around. But I do think what the lesson of wilderness has been for me and of COVID, ultimately, I think, is that is the experience of drawing closer to God and taking time after that experience to remember that shuddering sense of dependence on God. So Frank, back to you for any thoughts or as you head into this discussion.
Well, David, thank you so much. Could you say a little bit about the genesis of the writing of your book? And I mean, did you go into the wilderness and then after you left, you said, oh, I ought to write a book about this? Or were you thinking, I ought to write a book and go in the wilderness? I mean, what was kind of the genesis?
Yeah, well, I mentioned a minute ago about that notepad, and I had come through after a number of experiences, less together with other people than alone. I was always struck by just when you're alone, there's something about, every step you're conscious of. Is there something down there my foot's about to hit that I really don't want to, to step on? And so you have that sense of vulnerability. And by the time I reached a certain point that I had accumulated enough writing in my informal writing, and it coincided with something. My father was a wonderful man, a stockbroker in Washington, D.C., but he saw no need for the protection of wilderness. And so he and I used to argue. He said, why shouldn't wilderness be used to extract the resources? The minerals and the trees, and I mean, it should be utilized. And he was a great guy, but his love of the land really ended at golf courses. Although he was a member of a country club in Washington, D.C., and he gave the country club a willow oak, it's a beautiful tree. And after about 30 years, it grew to a lovely, and in his old age, he lived and he worked until he was like 95. But when he was about 90 years old, he heard that the club was going to cut down the tree to give a better view onto the golf course. And my father, the stockbroker, said, I will chain myself to the tree. So he became an environmentalist in his old age. So I ended up writing a letter to my father, mentioning, and a lot of the language in the book Wilderness Sojourn comes out of a letter that I sent originally to my father. And I wrote it in that format. If I remember right, I think I wrote that letter and I sent it to Christianity Today, because I just thought they would be I really wanted to aim it to Christians that were very devout, but probably on the conservative side, maybe not strongly environmental. Although obviously there are many conservative and Christians. We work very closely in DC on some lobbying issues with the Evangelical Environmental Network. But the audience of the Christianity Today was what I thought I wanted. I think, if I remember right, they wrote back and said, this works, but maybe not as a letter to your father. And so then I modified it from that thing. But it came out of, I think, as so much does, in response to trying to persuade someone else to see something in a different way.
Could you say something, David, about sort of the difference between sort of enforced loneliness that many of us have experienced during, especially this COVID, I call it the COVID detention period we've been in, over against chosen solitude and the difference?
Yeah, and I think writers, and they're much better. There's so many good writers on this, from Merton and Carlo Corretto, and a whole lot of people have written. Annie Dillard. Many people have written better than I have on this, obviously, and thought more deeply. But and I think, to your point about the loneliness of COVID, I was struck by this. Our son-in-law, we have a son-in-law who's a doctor at Boston Children's Hospital. And he's a pediatric, he works in the pediatric emergency room. He's a doc there. He's seen no cases of the flu this year because everyone's protecting themselves so well from COVID. No one's getting the flu.
Yeah.
But he said the beds are overflowing with young people aged 6 to 18 with mental health problems because of that enforced loneliness, that difficulty of the isolation that everyone is feeling during this. But I think the difference comes is, and I think the word enforced and voluntary are key here, is most of the time, if we remember at least if I'm remembering my life pre-COVID, it was filled with, you know, 100 emails a day and unbelievable number of distractions and phone calls. And I'm sure many of your all's lives were very similar to that. How often David Brower was the founder of Friends of the Earth. He asked once in an article he wrote, how often have you ever voluntarily, what's the longest time you've ever been alone voluntarily in a way that you wanted to be? And most people would, and now people would answer very differently post-COVID, but at that time, solitude chosen voluntarily was very rare for many people. And so,
well, maybe there are questions that the rest of the folks around our world and our screen would have for David, and this would be a good chance for you to make an observation or a question. So the floor is open. Oh,